All right. I'm ready. I end up voting affirmative in this round, and I vote affirmative because of a lot of stuff that happens on the framework flow that I don't think the 2NR adequately kicks out of. So the alternative of boring politics, that we should engage in state bureaucratic politics, assumes that the state action is good. But all of their arguments for why state action is bad is on framework. And so when you don't go for those framework arguments, you concede all of the state action is bad and we create systems of racism and we create systems of violence, which means that even though, even if you win that neoliberalism might be the cause of these, you can't be able to solve them because your alternative to neoliberalism is caught up in advocating the state. And so it becomes difficult to delineate out those two arguments when you've made arguments for while you've made state good arguments, they respond to state good arguments, and then your alternative relies on it. Now, it might be true that your boring politics might not be the state action of what framework is talking about, but the articulation of it in the 2NR makes it seem a lot like you just need to have a labor rights movement that can make a demand upon the state that can engage in bureaucratics, but you stop having sensationalized politics over like poetry and like individual action and stuff like that, and so we have to put that focus on the state. But that entire debate exists on the framework flow, which means that when you just say, okay, you could do what you want now, so it's not a reason to reject us, you're conceding the substantive arguments which the 2AR then extends and explains why the state is bad. Now, I will give you that the 2AR and the 1AR and the 2AC should all be more explicit about how framework and the critique alternative directly contradict one another. But in the 2AC and the 1AR, I do hear you could cross-apply like our Reed-Brinkley evidence, or you could cross-apply our argument onto the K-flow. So there is a cross-application that's made in both, but that would be how your two speaker points would get up, is by in the 2AC clearly explaining the tension and then leveling those arguments against each other more directly, right? Like, because part of the link levels of their class structure stuff would be anti their framework type arguments, but the end point of how your impact training framework is the same sort of impact trains that you need to be doing for the neoliberalism K. Okay. And so being more explicit on that would be beneficial, but I don't think it's a new argument or that I'm really doing work for them, because that's the entirety of that framework flow.
That makes sense.
There could be judges who could be like, well, it was on the framework flow and that work.
I get what you're saying.
So it's like, there's a little bit of it, like, it could, if this was an elimination round, it would very easily could be a 2-1 decision. But like, and I think that all you needed to do was just sort of answer those arguments there, because I think you've got the analysis on how, sensationalized politics is bad. You're good on the link story, you're good on the impact story, but then you have to get that alternative story in relationship to those framework cards, and opposed to what you do is like, they have no answer to the alternative, that means we have to engage in the state, except they do, and it's all over the place on that one flow. So you have to, take that work and be able to utilize it there, opposed to just sort of like moving on without addressing that portion of it.
How do you weigh the Giroux evidence that says that, like, so outside of the alt, I get how the alt fails. Do you weigh like the case turns from the critique external from the alternative, or do I just lose those? Because
here the other thing that it figures into the ballot is that there is only one clear, at this point, extension of the role of the ballot, which is the way that we create survivability in order to resist civil society. So if your strategy is not, because it's like whoever best performs the strategy of survival, right? And so if you're not winning the alternative, you're not functioning within that role of the ballot. So that means that they're the only one that is a performance that could be a rejection of civil society. And while that may fail, it's the only one that rejects civil society, where you're still caught up within civil society because of the way that you then engage in that state practices. So if you have a role of the ballot that runs counter to that, or explain that impact turn in relation to their role of the ballot, either one of those options, then I would have to be able to evaluate that turn more directly. But if it's, it could be, instead of the role of the ballot is best who performs the strategies, it could be the role of the ballot is whose advocacies actually best provide an avenue out of these situations. So even if you might perform a resistance strategy, we don't perform a resistance strategy. If your strategy gets caught up into something that doesn't actualize change, then that would be a reason for why that they should still lose around, even if the alternative doesn't function. But if the alternative is problematic and the role of the ballot is who best performs a resistance strategy, then even if you win a case turn, I'm still going to be forced to vote for the team that has a resistance strategy, even if that resistance strategy fails, right? So it just takes another role of the ballot, or the work of why the case turn matters in relation to the role of the ballot, versus like, you execute almost as like if they fiat like this new worldview, it'll get co-opted with the neoliberalism and turn back itself. But if it's about what they're doing in this room performatively, that matters based upon that roll of the ballot. So either that interaction or a roll of the ballot, or the alternative interacted with the state bad stuff on the framework flow. Those are sort of the three different ways where you would be able to have inroads to capture on ballot. Any one of them would have been a fine strategy, and I would recommend picking one of those three options, like either win a counter roll of the ballot, win their roll of the ballot, or just when we need the state. But what makes it a little strange is that, like, because you run framework, state good, and your alternative to cap is we have to engage in the state, it's really like the alternative is almost framework in a large extent, right? Because we should go back to boring politics, so it then becomes like double the amount of work that you do. So I think that in the future, not doing framework but having that boring politics stuff allows you to sort of covertly insert framework into the round and state politics good, because if they drop that, then you could in the block throw down on state politics good, engagement good, all the stuff that ends up being right in the framework debate.
Do you think I should have done like one off cap, and then if they mishandled the alternative, like blown up the framework debate in the block?
Right, but I wouldn't call it framework anymore. I would just call it we need to engage the state. State action is good, right? And then their offense about you try and not let us say stuff doesn't apply anymore, because you're like, we have a competitive strategy. And when they say whoever best performs the strategy, you'd be like, we did perform it. We were pretty boring, and we were just talking about bureaucratic state interactions, which means we are the best performance. So if we win, capitalism is what causes these forms of oppression, then our performance of that boring politics is good because we say that we should engage the state, whereas you do something different. And so then it's like the state good stuff gets hidden a little bit more, so it's strategic. You don't have to win two distinctly different flows, and you don't have to get into a situation where you might be like, well, you've excluded a different type of voice, right? So
what else would you put in the 1 and C in that situation where you do like the one-off cap shell?
I mean, you could run more arguments on case, right? They're within prostitution. You could talk about prostitution is bad, that they might, they might no link it. You could talk about the way that poetry is bad, and then poetry gets co-opted. There's a lot of stuff about why using individual stories is problematic outside of just capitalism, but the way that the academy eats up individual stories and just becomes a tokenistic gesture that turns it back against itself. You can make ballot commodification arguments, any diversity of case arguments, or run a second critique. Right, a second critique that's not going to get you into framework stuff, framework problems, and you kick out of one or the other of it. And I think that that's fine. So, yeah, more case or a second critique would be my suggestions about what the 1 and C would be instead. Framework wouldn't be bad if framework was more distinct from your neoliberalism argument. So it's like if the alternative to neoliberalism wasn't just use the state, then there's like two distinct things. So if you kick out a framework, you're not getting that offense doesn't necessarily apply. Because the alternative is what it is, it does apply. So just a different alternative on neoliberalism. Like if you got up here and said rejecting neoliberalism in all instances was your alternative, then them saying state is bad has no traction against that argument because you're no longer advocating that state. So I think that it would have been a fine 1 and C strategy where you don't get into some of the issues that cause you to lose around if there was a different alternative besides just the state-based alternative.
Do you think that I could do the boring politics alternative and articulate it differently, or do you think that the boring politics alternative is just not able to get out of the framework arguments?
I would have to look at the card, but the way it's articulated in the 2NR, you say it's like an engagement with bureaucratic processes where we utilize the state, right?
Okay.
Which means that if they win, the state is bad and is always violent, which is what their answers to framework will almost always be, then you're going to have to win that framework stuff independently. Like if you look at the card and it's talking about not just like bureaucratic politics, but talks about different forms of dialogue that like is not sensationalized, and it's about the way that we communicate. So we don't necessarily need to use the state, but we shouldn't have like emotional poetry or individual accounts. We just talk about a very universalizing system in the way that capitalism, like in sort of like the boring humdrum of this is something that everyone has to deal with that affects everyone, and that's what brings people together, versus the sensationalization which fractures the group. So if the evidence supports that claim, then you could draw that distinction. I don't know whether it does or does not, because I know your spin in the end and sort of remember the evidence from the 1 and C.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And then you don't need to prompt her as much as you do. Most of the time, your prompts are stuff that it seems like she's getting to anyhow, so it's just wasting some it's just wasting speaking time, is what I would say. But I think that beyond that, I think that you're doing a good job of drawing the lines and making connections throughout the entirety of the debate. Something that I would do that you didn't do in the 2AR or the 1AR as explicitly as it happens in the 2AC is that while you win on the arguments that exist on framework, it's because the arguments that exist on framework answer the capitalism alternative, but you would not in this round win like framework is unconditional and you should lose for having one framework for holding us up as a result of that, right? So you win the arguments on framework just because it also impact turns are alternative, but you didn't do enough work where I would be able to say, because you ran framework, you lose a round because of the exclusionary politics that you've already put in place. And so that would be the argumentative development that you need to do a little bit more of in order to be able to cut against the quicker kickouts of framework. All right, so more of why framework should be unconditional when being run, especially if you have the feeling that they're going to go for the critique, which is likely in the world where they have the 2NC goes all for the critique. Okay?
I have a question. My 1AR was a complete train wreck. Was there, like, what ways could I improve it?
It wasn't a complete train wreck.
Oh.
It was not.
Okay,
Yeah, what you could have done to improve it is better isolated the pieces of offense and gone for fewer arguments with more analysis, opposed to extending a bunch of different things in different flows.
Okay.
Right, and so it's like if you more clearly referred to 2AC arguments and just sat on fewer of them, it would be better than sort of answering it. So you sort of allow the negative to control the structure of the debate where you're answering their arguments, opposed to allowing your partner's 2AC to control the structure of the debate where you're extending her arguments and using those arguments to answer everything. You're sort of restarting the debate with answering, opposed to going back to the original 2AC args.
So in this scenario, like, what pieces of offense would you suggest for me to extend, like the Reeves card, the Yancey cards?
Well, you do them all, so you get the ones I would like. I would like you to do fewer of them in depth. I think all the 2AC arguments are good arguments to use. You now have to pick in relation to the debate and which ones you're best at articulating, which ones to go for. I like the Yancey stuff. The Collins 1AC extension is good. So those would be the evidence that to me intuitively works the best against this position. But you could use any of them. They're not, all of them were responsive and correct. You just then in the 1AR go for all of them all over. Okay. Yep. Okay. Any other questions?
Just questions about 2AC.
I think it was good. The 2AR you could have potentially gotten me on framework as unconditional because the argument is sort of in the 2AC and the 1AR, but you don't really spend enough time there. And I think that you could also be more explicit that once we win that state is bad on the framework flow, that answers the alternative because their alternative relies on the state, and versus like having state is bad, which is in the debate, versus their boring politics stuff. Doing that lining up more directly would increase your speaker points.
I didn't vote on this, but I was just curious, what for you with the root causation, what did that come down to?
I think they're doing a little bit better job of explaining why neoliberalism is a root cause, but I'm believing your argument that how can they say what's best for black female liberation, right? It's like
not even just that, but just the idea that neoliberalism is a starting point when there are other systems that other us. But I guess that doesn't answer the root cause. It just explains.
Right, the root cause of how things are structured currently and stuff like
Right,
that. So
right.
I just think they're doing a little bit deeper analysis. I don't necessarily think they're entirely right on that, but I do like the argument that having a root cause claim ignores intersectionality and the importance of other competing identities. So even if neoliberalism and capitalism is bad, to identify any single root cause is uniquely problematic. And I think that jives with what you're saying, because you're not saying necessarily that race is the root cause or gender is the root cause.
We need to use that when we're talking about it.
Right, yeah, so I would do, because you answer more like we have a different root cause, I would probably just tweak that to root cause analysis bad, right? And the attempt to find a root cause of things might in fact be the root cause because it's constantly segmenting identities, right? And compartmentalizing people instead of thinking about ways in which different people in different places and different locations at different times have different struggles that are necessary to be able to do things.
I didn't want to be like, because you're female, you don't understand my thing, but I was just saying the way that, we view the opposition or oppression to class is very...
Yeah, it came out more of like, we have another root cause, race ends up being at the central root cause, but you weren't doing that much analysis on it because, as you just told me, you want to go for the other argument.
Right.
So they're doing more analysis on why neoliberalism is the root cause than I'm getting on your root cause type argument. So I think that if you could change that to just root cause analysis bad, their attempt to do a root cause analysis is exactly the problems that create the situation that our 1AC is indicting.
Okay.
Do you think that we have the right stuff in the 2AC?
Yeah, I think that the answers in the 2AC were the correct answers on all of the blows, so I thought that was good. Yep. All right. Anything else?
Yay, that's all.
Thank you.